In this video, we're going to explore some of the caving gone wrong incidents. The last story is a must-watch, so be sure to stick around until the end. Stephen's Gap is one of the most beautiful caves in the world. Its massive pit, with an almost biblical beam of sunlight cascading from above, is tailor-made for Hollywood movies. The entrance to the pit is supposedly one of the most photographed in North America, and it's easy to see why. But despite its apparent serenity, Stephen's Gap is also known for devouring explorers alive. And recently, the Gap has claimed more lives than usual. Before we dive into the video, I want to take a moment to thank all of you who have subscribed to this channel. Our subscriber rate has grown from 8% to 13%, which is truly amazing. If you're new here, simply click the subscribe button, like this video, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest uploads. Now let's get into the video. Stephen's Gap is located in Jackson County, Alabama, about 30 miles east of the state's most populous city, Huntsville. It's fairly easy to reach by car. If you're traveling from Huntsville, the drive will only take you about a half hour. The entrance to the Stephen's Gap Callahan Cave Preserve is only a little ways off the freeway, making it much more accessible than other similar caves around the world. While it's easy to travel there, actually getting into the cave is more complicated. In order to visit Stephen's Gap, you're required by law to get a permit. The preserve is privately owned, and Stephen's Gap is protected by the Southeastern Cave Conservancy, the largest land conservancy in the world dedicated entirely to protecting caves. This sounds intimidating, but aside from the mild inconvenience, these permits are probably fairly easy to get. One of the unique things about Stephen's Gap is that you don't have to be an experienced cave diver to go inside it. In fact, it is possible to walk into the main pit with no more equipment than some decent hiking boots. Some visitors have even been able to camp inside the cave, although other sources give the impression this has either never been allowed or is not allowed anymore. Most people seem to agree the permits are a good thing, as they help regulate the influx of visitors and preserve the cave. Even with the permit requirement, the cave is still a very popular spot, with applicants needing to reserve their time slot around 2 to 3 weeks in advance. It's safe to assume the majority of visitors to Stephen's Gap do so on foot. However, there is a smaller subset of more daring visitors who opt to rappel down. Doing this can be both visually stunning and adrenaline pumping. From the opening in the ceiling, measured from the edge of the hole, the bottom of the pit is a whopping 143 feet directly below. This large vertical passageway, which is often described as the keyhole, is quite wide and roughly cylindrical in shape. This is the spot from which sunlight pours into the underground cavern, and it is arguably one of the main features that makes this such a popular spot for photographers. To descend mid-air along this ray of sunlight is nothing short of a caving enthusiast's dream, but it is not for those who don't have proper equipment or lots of prior experience. Frighteningly, even when you're experienced and you bring all the necessary gear with you, things can still go wrong. At Stephen's Gap, when they go wrong, they go really wrong. And in 2019, more than one unfortunate visitor met their demise at the bottom of Stephen's Gap. The first life to be claimed by Stephen's Gap was that of Juan Cruses. Juan was from Madison, a small city on the opposite side of Huntsville from Stephen's Gap. Juan was born in November 1994, so in the spring of 2019, he was just 24 years old. According to reports, Juan left his home on Thursday, April 11th to go hiking by himself. All that was apparently known by friends and family at the time was that he was planning to hike in Jackson County. It's possible that Juan himself wasn't sure where exactly he wanted to hike. After all, traveling alone leaves ample room for spontaneity. Although we don't know for sure, it seems likely that going off to spend the day alone hiking was not unusual for Juan, as there are no reports that his family was worried about him, at least not at first. However, when Juan never came back that evening, his family filed a missing persons report. The following day, which was Friday, April 12th, the Jackson County Police began an investigation into the whereabouts of Juan Cruses. Knowing that Juan was out hiking probably helped to narrow the search right from the beginning, but the police still had a fairly large range of possible places to look. Jackson County is well over 1,000 square miles, and there are numerous areas full of hiking trails. After some time, Jackson County Police came across Juan Cruses' car in the place they were probably least hoping to find it, the parking lot at Stephen's Gap Callahan Cave Preserve. This must have sent a chill down the spines of the officers. Stephen's Gap is a well-known landmark in the area, and not at all a place you want to have to look for a missing person. Fearing the worst, Jackson County Police quickly notified the Scottsboro-Jackson County Rescue Squad, who came to help search the area. They searched all over the park, the trails, and even in some parts of the cave. However, due to the obvious need for highly specialized equipment, the crew wasn't able to fully search the cave. Even though they hadn't found any trace of Juan Cruses, the crew knew they needed to make absolutely sure that every inch of the cave had been thoroughly covered. Before leaving to continue the search elsewhere, they called the Huntsville Cave Rescue Unit. As their title suggests, this unit showed up with all the necessary equipment and expertise to descend into Stevens Gap and conduct a total search of the infamous keyhole. Sadly, against the hopes of everyone on the scene, it was at this point that the body of Juan Cruses was found. He had fallen all the way down the 143 feet keyhole to a horrific death at the very bottom. We have only a couple clues as to the state of Juan's body upon discovery. The first is that Jackson County Sheriff Chuck Phillips was able to identify the body as being that of Juan. Considering the kind of damage one can imagine a fall like this causing, this is frankly amazing, although we don't exactly how Sheriff Phillips was able to make the identification. The second is that officials choose not to order an autopsy, so while Juan Cruses was still recognizable, the fact that he had fallen and been killed was so obvious to those at the scene that they felt no need to investigate any further. Even if the cause of death, in the most immediate sense, was crystal clear, there are still many questions that should have been raised. Why was a hiker going anywhere near the opening to Stevens Gap in the first place? As I mentioned earlier, Stevens Gap is unique in that there is a walkable path to get inside the cave from another entry point. How is that nobody saw or heard anything? This is a popular cave. Visitors come and go every day, and some apparently even camp overnight. A person falling down the 143 feet keyhole and landing at the bottom seems like just about the most noticeable thing that could possibly happen inside Stevens Gap. And yet, there are no witnesses. Was the cave empty? Did Juan fall in the middle of the night? Why was he there in the middle of the night? Another question, which is sure to at least cross the mind of anyone who hears this story, is that of whether Juan fell or jumped. I can't speculate on this because I didn't know Juan and haven't spoken to anyone from his family or friend group. However, I can tell you that, assuming they were doing their jobs diligently, Jackson County Police would have absolutely considered this possibility and pursued it, and they ruled Juan's death an accident. Even then, there's still a sense that not every question has been answered with this story. How did Juan accidentally fall into one of the most famous landmarks in the county, especially if he was an experienced hiker who was familiar with the nature in the area? In the end, Juan tragically took most of the answers to the bottom of Stevens Gap with him. Juan Cruses would not turn out to be the only person claimed by Stevens Gap in 2019. Just a few months later, a young man named Philip Whitehead was visiting Jackson County on vacation. Whitehead was from Florida. He was also serving in the military at the time and was stationed at Fort Campbell, which is about 3 hours north of Jackson County. One of the items on Whitehead's itinerary was visiting Stevens Cave with one of his friends. Being an adventure-seeking young man, Whitehead wanted to try rappelling down the infamous keyhole. It's not clear what level of experience he had with rappelling, although his being in the military probably increases the likelihood that he had some experience, and certainly increases the likelihood that he was at least in good overall physical condition. His friend, however, was definitely experienced with rappelling. In fact, multiple reports say that his friend had actually rappelled down Stevens Gap more than once before. Going to the cave, the two brought plenty of equipment. I would also assume that they acquired the necessary permits, although we don't know this for sure, and, as we'll see later, we have at least some reason to doubt it. This descent started out like any other. The two harnessed themselves in, checked, double-checked, gave themselves the green light, and stepped over the edge. I doubt they went at the same time, even though it is possible they did. Given that they probably didn't, I would guess that Philip Whitehead went first. It would make some sense, as his more experienced friend could provide more guidance in the very beginning of his descent if he needed it. But the main reason I'm guessing this is because Philip's friend is still alive. Disaster struck Philip at some point as he was making his long and spacious descent through the sunlit vertical tunnel. Multiple reports, which one assumes rely on the testimony of Philip's friend and maybe other witnesses as well, state that a loud pop was heard. Officials would later speculate that this pop could have been the sound of the rope snapping, or the breaking of the metal carabiner which attached Philip to the rope. Either way, it was quite literally the worst thing that could have happened. Philip's gradual descent was immediately transformed into a total freefall. Even more tragically, his friend was powerless to help as he watched his friend plummet to his inevitable death. Once again, the Huntsville Cave Rescue Unit was called to duty. They were able to recover the lifeless body of Philip Whitehead, who became the second young man in just a few months to have his life tragically cut short at Stevens Gap. This was enough to inspire a significant public effort on the part of local officials to try and educate the public and encourage safer behavior. Brian Bailey, the chief of operations for the Huntsville Cave Rescue Unit, made the following public statement shortly after Philip Whitehead's death. If you plan on visiting the site, go to the Southeastern Cave Conservancy website and get a permit. Stay on the marked trails and stay away from the edge of the pit. Use good common sense. This statement seems to imply that neither Philip Whitehead nor Juan Cruses had permits, and that neither one of them was using good common sense. But is that true? Juan Cruses most likely wasn't planning on entering Stevens Gap at all, so the issue of whether or not he had a permit is irrelevant. The opinion of those who worked the case and the available information all seem to suggest that his death was an accident, which could very well have been prevented being more careful, as Bailey suggests. But somehow that doesn't seem like a satisfactory solution. The fact that Juan, a young, fit 24-year-old, accidentally fell down one of the largest and most well-known keyholes in the country is quite odd, and we don't really know how it happened, because as far as we know, no one was there to witness it. As for Philip Whitehead, we have no reason to doubt that he and his friend both acquired the necessary permits, other than Brian Bailey seemingly implying that they didn't, and that if they had, somehow that would have prevented the tragedy. Whitehead was a young military man who brought an experienced friend and the necessary equipment. It would be strange if, despite all this thoughtful preparation, they both somehow neglected the legally required permits that one would assume they'd have to sneak into the preserve without. I think the truth is that Brian Bailey, the Huntsville Cave Rescue Unit, and other officials simply don't know what else to do. Encouraging the public to be careful and to make sure they follow all the rules seem like natural reactions to these two successive events, but neither suggestion really addresses anything that either of the victims did wrong. The much darker reality that perhaps no one wants to address is that disasters like these can simply happen without warning. Competent, responsible people who know what they're doing and have done it before can still fall prey to the very thing their experience and precaution are supposed to prevent. All it takes is one slip, one snapped rope, one step too far in the wrong direction. The Lost River Cave sounds like a place from an Indiana Jones movie. It also looks like one. Let's face it, there aren't a whole lot of caves on this planet that you can explore on a boat, or that have been featured by Ripley's Believe It or Not. It's a unique place great for families to visit, but it also boasts a dramatic history and, on rare occasions, has even turned deadly. Lost River Cave is located in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Bowling Green is the third largest city in Kentucky, but the nearest big city to it is actually Nashville, Tennessee, since Bowling Green sits quite close to Kentucky's southern border. Aside from this cave, the biggest thing Bowling Green is probably known for is the National Corvette Museum. It's not really a place that draws millions of visitors every tourist season. The existence of Lost River Cave within its city limits is something of an anomaly. Most cities don't get to have such an unusual natural landmark just a few minutes away from the local shopping mall. The entrance to Lost River Cave, which is literally across the street from a Popeye's chicken restaurant, is among the largest cave entrances in the eastern United States. The cave itself is really a cave system, which stretches out for 7 miles underground. As the name suggests, the cave has a fairly wide river running through it. For a long time, the river was also thought to be insanely deep. When geologists first began trying to measure the depth of the water, they used something called a plumb bob, a small, pointed weight on the end of a string. Although I haven't read any direct accounts of this, there's a good chance that the first time they tried it, they ran out of string. They didn't need just a few feet of it, or even just a few dozen feet of it. To their surprise, geologists ended up needing hundreds of feet of string to measure the depth of the Lost River. After some adjustments to their string supply, they finally managed to get the plumb bob to hit what they thought was the bottom of the river, at an astonishing 437 feet below the surface. They were measuring at a section called the Blue Hole. Blue holes are essentially sinkholes, and they appear in other places around the world, such as the Bahamas and the South China Sea. The fact that there was a blue hole inside a cave in the middle of the US that appeared to be nearly 450 feet deep helped catapult Lost River Cave to international fame. In fact, this extraordinary depth was the main reason why Lost River Cave ended up being featured in Ripley's Believe It or Not. but disappointingly, readers should have chosen not to believe this one. It was later discovered that these insane measurements were wildly inaccurate, but they were wildly inaccurate for an interesting reason. The blue hole in Lost River Cave actually connects to another river, one that runs underground, so technically the blue hole is only 16 feet deep. The Plum Bob was just getting swept underground, making it seem like it kept descending and descending. This was a clever trick by Lost River Cave. No one seemed to figure it out until long after it had become a famous tourist destination, and many are still on the fence about the true depth. This apparently includes the government of Kentucky, whose Energy and Environment Cabinet still says on its website that the blue hole's depth is supposedly 437 feet. No matter how deep it is, the blue hole is still an amazing feature of the cave, and it's not the only reason the cave is an amazing place to visit. Today, on a boat, it takes roughly a half hour to tour the whole cave, because that's how much there is to see and explore inside. The cave also has a fascinating history to learn about. People were storing food and using the cave for shelter as long as 10,000 years ago. Around the turn of the 19th century, a water mill was built here, and, for a long time, it was the only underground water mill in the United States. During the Civil War, Bowling Green was Kentucky's provisional capital as part of the Confederacy. During the Union Army takeover, Union soldiers used the cave as a camp, as many as 40,000 of them. According to local archaeologists, you can still see the names of Union soldiers carved into the walls. My favorite part of the Lost River Cave story is what happened during Prohibition. According to local legend, although this has never been proven, the cave was used by bootleggers to make alcohol illegally. After Prohibition, and this part we know for sure, the cave was turned into a nightclub. Yeah, no joke, a nightclub. The club hosted a number of famous musical acts, including the NBC Orchestra. Billboard described it as the only air-conditioned nightclub at the time because it was so naturally cool inside. For reasons that could only have to do with the general public being no fun, the club went out of style and closed in the 1960s. The cave went into a period of decline, filling with trash. It wasn't until the 1990s that an effort was made to refurbish the cave and open it for tourism. Paying to take a boat tour is generally the way most people experience Lost River Cave today. However, there are those who try and explore the cave alone. You're not supposed to do this. The property is privately owned, so you have to avoid getting caught just to get inside. Despite the obvious intrigue, I, of course, cannot recommend that anybody try this. Not only is it dangerous, it's also illegal. But I can tell you the story of what happened when one man tried to do it. His name was Danny L. Vaughn Jr. Danny grew up in Warren County, the same county where Bowling Green is. He was born in 1990 and spent 30 years of his life living near Lost River Cave before he seemingly decided enough was enough. He was going to try and explore the cave. I say this in speculation. As far as I've been able to uncover, nobody really knows for sure what Danny's motivation was. Danny reached the age of 30 during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Stores were closed, families were forced to stay home. Needless to say, tours of Lost River Cave were canceled indefinitely, and there was no way, at least no legal way, to get in. Danny had a daughter. He also had a decent-sized family full of siblings, aunts, uncles, grandparents, and cousins. There's no real way to know, but I think we can safely assume Danny's experience of COVID-19 was much like it was for most people. Stressful, tragic, highly disruptive, and after a while, full of boredom and restlessness. I guarantee you, Danny L. Vaughn Jr. is not the only person in Warren County who thought about sneaking into Lost River Cave during lockdown. What sets Danny apart is that it appears he went out and actually tried to do it. As I described earlier, one of the many things that makes Lost River Cave unique is its central location. As a matter of fact, it is right off the side of the highway. This poses both advantages and disadvantages for sneaking in. For a massive cave with a 7-mile river inside it, the place is remarkably easy to get to. You could even stop across the highway at Lost River Liquors and grab some beer on your way in. Being right next to the highway is also pretty ideal for making a quick getaway if needed. At the same time, being in such a central location means there are people around most of the time. Of course, due to COVID, there were no tours happening and the cave itself was empty, but the whole surrounding area wasn't. Danny may have planned meticulously for this, or he may have had no plan at all. None of us really have any idea. All we know is that there was at least one witness to the event. At around 6:30 p.m. on March 11, 2020, Danny L. Vaughn Jr. was seen climbing over the fence and entering Lost River Cave. The witness who saw him called the police immediately. Why they were so quick to call the authorities must have one of two possible explanations. The first is that the person called because they saw Danny fall into the water. This would explain why they were so quick to dial 911. They thought he had an accident and was probably hurt. The second explanation is that the person who called was simply calling because he was trespassing and they wanted to report it. This begs the question of whether Danny fell or not. Frustratingly, local news reports seem to conflict on this. The local NBC station reported that officials on the scene said Danny jumped over the fence and fell into the river. But the local ABC station quoted an officer named Tim Gray, who said, "We don't know if the individual jumped or fell from the fence, but we are aware of witnesses who did see him climb over the fence and did not see him resurface." Well, which is it? I've never been to Lost River Cave, but based on the multitude of photographs and video footage available online, I have not seen anything I would describe as a fence. There are certain sections inside the cave where there are railings, low metal beams along the river's edge. But there doesn't appear to be a fence that a witness from outside the cave could see Danny climbing over. But in May 2020, there might have been a temporary fence blocking entry to the cave, which had been shut down due to COVID just a month earlier. If I had to guess, that's probably what Danny climbed over and what the witness reported to the police. If that's true, it means Danny most likely didn't fall. He was just obviously sneaking in. What Danny got up to while he was in there is something we'll never know. The sad and mysterious ending to the story is that he somehow drowned in the river. If you frame the story like it was a madman who leapt over the fence, fell, and drowned, well, then it doesn't sound so peculiar. But if you dig a little deeper, as I think you and I have, we see that it probably wasn't that simple. Danny probably didn't fall. And if he had fallen, he wouldn't have landed in the water, because he was probably climbing over a temporary fence that was blocking the opening of the cave, which is a bit of a distance from where the river actually sits. But how did Danny drown? Most of the river is only 4 or 5 feet deep. Sure, it's supposedly possible to drown in an inch of water, but if you're a full-grown male with enough physical agility to leap over a fence, how likely is it that, sadly, like so many cases, with this, we simply don't have enough information? It's possible no one does. Besides the witness who called the police, and according to Officer Gray only saw him until he passed over the fence, no one saw Danny again until his body was recovered from the water. Was he a thrill seeker looking for an escape amid the stress and confinement imposed by COVID restrictions? Was he suffering a nervous breakdown? Did he somehow fall or hurt himself in the water in such a way that he couldn't swim or even stand up in the shallow river? Or did something else happen? What do you think happened? Post your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to like the video and subscribe for more caving stories in the near future. That's all for now. I'll see you next time.